Memphis Mayor Paul Young mentioned Seattle and their consent decree. My next guest was in Seattle when that was going down. Bob Scales is CEO of Police Strategies. He joins us now from Seattle. Bob, first of all, what is Police Strategies?
We're a company that helps law enforcement agencies collect and analyze and report on their data, mostly use of force data.
Okay. And you are, in terms of when you say help law enforcement, are you funded by police departments or are you funded by other sources? So, like, what
Yeah,
are
so
you, like, are you hired by police departments?
yeah, so one of the big problems we have is that there is no national and very few statewide use of force databases. So oftentimes when we talk about use of force, we're operating without any data. And there aren't any evidence-based best practices for use of force policies or training. So one of our goals is to help law enforcement agencies understand their use of force data so they can make better policy and training decisions.
Okay. So, why do you say consent decrees are ineffective?
Well, my first experience with consent decrees was in Seattle in 2011 when the Department of Justice announced that they were doing a pattern of practice investigation of Seattle PD. And I was in the Seattle City Attorney's Office at the time and was selected to represent the city during the investigation. That was a very quick investigation. It lasted 8 months. And then in December of 2011, the DOJ issued their findings letter, and we disagreed with their findings. And we asked to basically, DOJ said 20% of Seattle PD's use of force were excessive or unnecessary and unconstitutional. And we said that's not possible because we review all of the use of force incidents. So we asked to see the incidents that they found to be unconstitutional, and they refused to provide us with those incidents. We asked to talk to their experts and review their methodology, and they refused to identify their experts or provide the methodology. And it was very quickly, when we reviewed their findings report, we found a number of errors and fabrications in the findings report. And then it all sort of snowballed from there, and we saw how ineffective the entire system was.
When you say you found errors in there, first of all, you were working for the city of Seattle. So wasn't it your job with the city of Seattle to protect your police department? Because you're not you. It's not like you were a third party. You were a actually they were the findings were against the city of Seattle, and you were an attorney for the city of Seattle.
Correct. I mean, I was representing the city. The city was my client, and but what we did was we went through and the DOJ did not identify any of the incidents in their report. However, we were able to identify the fact patterns and match them up with actual police incidents. And what we found was that the way that the DOJ characterized these incidents was they either added information, they left out important information, or they just reached incorrect conclusions about what happened. And the DOJ never actually provided us with any evidence. We had to piece it together ourselves. So it's not a matter of did we interpret it differently than the DOJ? The DOJ put in factual information that was inaccurate.
You- but you say consent decrees don't work, but you're only speaking about what happened in Seattle. Do you have any other experience with other cities and consent decrees?
Yeah, so after when Seattle, the mayor decided to sign the consent decree about 6 months after the findings, or 8 months after the findings, and the mayor appointed me to be the compliance coordinator to oversee the reforms in the department, and I did that for about 2 years. And so I got a good sense of how the monitors work, how DOJ works, how federal judges work. And I've also spoken with most of the current cities from people in the department or in the city, most of the current cities that are currently under consent decrees. And I started sort of speaking out in social media, particularly on LinkedIn, about consent decrees because I saw the same problems happening in Seattle, happening in every single other city that was under a consent decree.
Okay, so but when you say the same problems, there have been other cities, other leaders that have actually welcomed these consent decrees. When Donald Trump, when his under his DOJ, Jeff Sessions, when they came in, they tried to stop the consent decree in Baltimore, and the city of Baltimore disagreed with them and said no, they wanted to move forward as well. And so, if you don't have if you don't have the Department of Justice doing what they do, how do you then get to the point of fixing the problem? Because citizens are being abused, citizens are being beaten, and in fact, these cities are paying out. We're approaching billion, not approaching. We're there billions of dollars in settlements due to the abusive, unconstitutional actions of cops.
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right that some cities have actually requested the DOJ to come in and investigate and welcome a consent decree. Baltimore is one example, New Orleans is another, and Chicago,
Yep.
Mayor Rahm Emanuel.
Philadelphia.
So,
Yep.
yeah, exactly. So that's absolutely right. And what you'll also find is every one of those cities regrets after 10 or 15 years of a consent decree, and after spending $100 million or more in costs, and after having, under the supervision of a federal judge that knows nothing about law enforcement, a monitor that knows nothing about law enforcement, and is making a profit, they find that their department and their public safety is much, much worse off than before they started.
And so, and how then? How do you tie that to the consent decree? So when you say it's much worse, how's it worse? And how are you blaming that on the consent decree?
Right. So Professor Roland Fryer from Harvard University is an economics professor. He did a study of pattern or practice investigations and consent decrees, and he found that during the first few months or years of a consent decree, violent homicides go up, and there were, I think he studied about 15 cities. There were an additional 900 homicides in those cities with consent decrees, and he attributed that to depolicing and disengagement. Because when the DOJ comes in,
hold on one second. Hold on one second. Hold on one second. Hold on. You okay? Just right before you stated that, you said that federal judges and monitors know nothing about law enforcement. What does an
correct.
economics professor at Harvard know about law enforcement?
He was studying data. He wasn't trying to manage departments. He was studying data and using statistical techniques to determine that the violent crime and homicide levels went up after a pattern or practice investigation, and he attributed that to the depolicing and disengagement effect. Because when the DOJ comes in, what they're telling officers is, we don't want you to make stops, we don't want you to make arrests, we don't want you to use force, we don't want you to get complaints. And the only way that the officers can comply is to basically disengage and not do any proactive policing and only respond to 911 calls. And that's what happens in every single city that is under investigation and goes into a consent decree, is you have this massive drop in arrests and an increase in crime.
Well, you're citing Roland Fryer's data, but literally at Harvard, Justin Feldman literally lays out that Fryer's data was wrong. There are individuals that actually dispute Fryer's report. Other folks and academics who do so. But you talk about what the department, what DOJ actually says. Well, this is what we also know. We know this for a fact. I lived in Chicago for 6 years, where there were cops in Chicago don't like oversight, don't like being having to report various things. Cops in Chicago admitted breaking radios, admitting not turning on body cameras, not turning on dashboard cameras. And so, how do we also account for cops who don't want any accountability, and they are making decisions that, oh, you know what? I'm just going to take this check and do nothing. And so, what are we supposed to do when you still have citizens who are being abused, who are being beaten, when you have cops who don't want to be held accountable?
Right. There are many problems with law enforcement. There are many bad officers that should not be police officers. The question is, what do we do about it? There's no consent decree that's been successful. There's no consent decree that has actually improved the constitutional policing in any city. What DOJ has the authority to do, but they rarely do, is prosecute the officers that actually commit the offenses. And if they did that, instead of blaming the mayor, blaming the city council, blaming the police chief, blaming policies, blaming training, they blame everybody except the officers that commit the crimes. And they let those officers, for example, in Minneapolis.
Go ahead.
In Minneapolis, in Baltimore, in Chicago, any major city that's had a high-profile officer-involved shooting or officer-involved death, the officers that may be involved in that particular death are prosecuted, but then the DOJ comes in and said, this is a widespread problem. There are officers every day that are violating people's constitutional rights. And the way we're going to fix it is to do a consent decree and change your policies and training, but every officer that's ever violated somebody's rights is going to get off scot-free. Because nobody's going to, the DOJ does not prosecute officers. They try to do these phony consent decrees that do nothing.
But wait a minute. But if we want to talk about prosecution, then isn't what you just said a direct indictment on district attorneys' offices, people who work closely with cops? Because here's the reality: on the federal level, they have a very narrow window, if you will, when it comes to civil rights violations. Former Attorney General Eric Holder talked about this here in terms of sort of how feds look at it. The reality is, when you look at a lot of these cases, part of the fundamental problem is they're not being prosecuted locally. And so shouldn't the onus on the first level be on these DAs who are doing their job? But I look at the Memphis report. They talk about how the Memphis Internal Affairs Department doing shoddy investigations. Isn't that their job? And so I get sort of this targeting about DOJ, but if local DAs and county DAs and internal affairs departments aren't doing their jobs, and these cops are not being indicted, what often happens is the DOJ becomes the last resort for many families, because the families are being let down by local and state district attorneys and attorney generals.
I absolutely agree. There should be, we should have fewer consent decrees and more prosecutions of officers who commit crimes and violate people's civil rights. Now,
but they're not doing it.
Well,
they're not doing it.
Well, but the question is about consent decrees, right? I don't have a solution for that, but I know that consent decrees are not the solution. So DOJ has the authority. So they came into Seattle and they said 20% of our use of force is unconstitutional. That means that the DOJ, in about 250 cases over 2 years, they had the legal authority to prosecute every officer who did unconstitutional policing, and they didn't do a single one. In fact, there was a
any statute of limitations.
Well, no, absolutely not. There was one of the reasons this started was a high-profile shooting of a Native American woodcarver, John T. Williams, in 2010. And my office referred that case to the U.S. attorney for prosecution. And the U.S. attorney declined it. They refused to prosecute the officer. We then referred it to the county prosecutor. They refused to prosecute it. We don't have jurisdiction. The city doesn't have jurisdiction to prosecute it.
Why?
So there's a U.S. attorney, so they won't prosecute the officer. But then a few months later,
no. I asked, why did the county attorney and why did the U.S. attorney decline to prosecute?
You'll have to ask them. We had evidence. We had sufficient evidence to charge an officer with homicide, and they refused to charge the case. But then they used that case. They used that case in their findings letter, and they said that officer committed constitutional violations, and that was the reason for the consent decree. But they refused, and they identified 250 other cases, and they didn't prosecute a single one.
So I'm curious. In that particular case there, cops can charge someone without the district attorney getting an indictment first. Did that happen?
No, no, no. It's impossible.
So so did so
The
s-
we
no, it's not actually
refer
no, it's not impossible.
what the police do is they
No.
refer cases for prosecution. The police cannot prosecute anyone. They refer cases to
That's not what I asked. That's not what I asked. If you said you have the evidence that this cop committed a homicide, did the police department go and arrest this cop and charge him with homicide?
He was not arrested, but he was referred. The case was investigated, and the case was referred to the U.S. attorney and the county prosecutor for prosecution. And they refused to indict the officer.
No. Here's my but no. See again, I'm going to ask this question again because this is the problem that and again I've covered way too many of these cases, and this is what happens. This is what happens. The police can actually arrest someone based upon their evidence, charge them with whatever that particular crime is. Then the next step is it going to the DA's office for an indictment. What I'm asking is, did the police in Seattle arrest this cop, saying we are making this arrest of homicide, and now after he's been arrested, now will the DA actually go seek an indictment? So what I'm asking is, did the police in Seattle arrest that cop and charge him with homicide? The police department's charging actions are separate from the prosecution's actions. So I want to know, what did the police do?
That's not accurate. No. So the police. You're correct that the police could have arrested the officer, but officers are not arrested until they are indicted, because arrest is used when the individual represents an immediate threat to public safety. So when officers
a cop, a police officer who kills somebody, that's not an immediate threat to the public.
Well, what happens after every officer involved shooting in every jurisdiction I know of is that the officer is immediately taken off active duty, right? And normally their firearms are taken away and until the investigation is completed. So that officer was actually fired just a few days after the incident. So he was fired by the police department. So he was no longer a police officer. But the issue is not whether he was arrested or not. The issue is, and the police cannot charge anyone. All they can do is refer a case for charging. Only the district attorney or the U.S. attorney can file charges. And so in every case, for example, Derek Chauvin, he wasn't arrested after the incident, but as soon as the indictment was filed, then he was arrested and arraigned. That's the way our system works.
That's part of the problem we have in our society. We have a completely separate law enforcement system when it comes to cops and when it comes to everybody else. My panel has questions. Lauren Victoria Burke, you're first.
Um, yeah, I don't know where to begin. My head is sort of spinning a little bit. I mean, Bob, don't you think that it's really the case that the consent decrees don't work because cops effectively in our society are a protected class, right? I mean, politicians protect police. Police are immune from most criticism, and this idea that the money. I thought that your point with regard to money was particularly laughable. My father was a cop in New York, and so my education, everything else was paid for by that on overtime. Police overtime in New York is through the roof. This idea that the consent decree is really expensive and so we shouldn't do it. Are you kidding me? We spend millions and millions and millions in this country on law enforcement. Law enforcement gets what they want. When they ask for money, they get money. There's not a politician, Democrat or Republican, that wants to be on the record against law enforcement funding. So, I mean, this idea that we as a Black community will sit here and watch video of Walter Scott getting shot in the back and Eric Garner getting choked out on the street, and all these other things, George Floyd, and not be a little bit disgruntled about that, I think is outrageous. I mean, we should be having more than just this, consent decrees. You've got to be kidding me. I mean, this idea. I think it was 2015 when Eric Holder, after Ferguson, Eric Holder investigated Jennings and Ferguson, and we found out that the cops were fleecing the black community in Ferguson. This is data. You want to talk about data and Roland Flyer? Let's talk about data. I mean, we've got so much data on this that it's ridiculous. So when you say that the consent decree doesn't work, it doesn't work because we in this society really respect and value and protect cops. Cops are a protected class. They're undeclared protected class. So I have no question. I guess that's my comment. But I find your entire thesis to be a little bit based on Washington State, a little bit challenging. I mean, I know you know about the ACLU suing the city of New York on stop and frisk, and they were stop and frisking basically all black people, all black men. So, give me a break with this general idea that we shouldn't be questioning law enforcement.
Well, that's not what I said. So all you have to do is, if you want to look at money, look at Chicago. The mayor tried to recently cut the Chicago PD's budget. And Chicago PD said, we can't do that because of the consent decree. And the monitor said, you can't do that. And the judge said, you can't do that. And DOJ said, you can't do that. So he restored all the cuts to Chicago PD. So consent decrees are a blank check for police departments. If you're into defunding the police, don't do a consent decree because they'll get everything they want under a consent decree. And not a single, if you look at the data, show me one city, cite one city where constitutional policing has improved because of a consent decree. And we have some consent decrees, like in Seattle, it's going on 15 years, Virgin Islands, 17 years. How long does it take to reform a police department?
Sir, there are no, we're not reforming. We're not reforming police.
But Bob,
right? I mean, we're not. The idea that we're somehow going to change the police in this country in itself, whether there's a consent decree or not, whether $100 million is spent or not, and I know that that's not going to happen. Police have a great deal of power in the United States of America. We spend millions of dollars out of budgets on police. That's not going to change. They're going to. You just saw probably the piece we just had in Memphis. They stop and frisk who they want. There are clear Fourth Amendment violations, and as long as you do it with the black community, no one is going to say anything. So this idea that somehow, wow, the biggest problem that we have here is that, wow, these naughty consent decrees. Really? Really? Tell that to the family of Walter Scott and Eric Garner and George Floyd.
Actually, one second. One second.
I said they don't work. The consent decrees don't work. If you want to spend money,
I want to show this.
Money,
Bob, one second.
Prosecute officers. Do that.
Bob. First of all, on this show, we've long said prosecute officers, but the problem that you have in prosecuting officers is that you have DAs who work with those very officers, and guess what? Cops rebel. No. 1 second. And again, part of the problem is that how the federal laws are set up. They have a very narrow window. When you talked about money, I pulled this up.
Not true.
Chicago taxpayers should. One second. First of all, Bob, we literally have had the Attorney General of the United States state that. So I'm only stating what Eric Holder said.
And it's not true.
I'm going to say this here.
All you have to do is
1 second. Between 2000... Bob, 1 second. Between 2019 and 2020... Bob, 1 second. Bob, 1 second. Bob, 1 second. Bob, 1 second. I want to speak to the money part. This is Chicago. Between 2019 and 2023, Chicago taxpayers paid $164.3 million to resolve lawsuits that named 200 Chicago cops. In all, the city spent $384.2 million to resolve lawsuits alleging approximately 1,300 Chicago police officers committed a wide range of misconduct. And if we go to New York, that number is approaching $1 billion. So the reality is, the amount of money we're spending with these lawsuits is unbelievable. Reese, what's your question?
I just want to clarify that the money is not spent on consent decrees. The money is spent on corrective actions that are identified and agreed upon within consent decrees. Consent decrees themselves don't cost money. You have a monitor, you have judges. That's not what's costing hundreds of millions of dollars. It's the programs, the ineffective programs, which I would agree with you if you want to say that the programs implemented supposedly to bring these police departments into compliance are ineffective, but that's not the consent decree itself. It's the programs that are selected. So my question would be, you say prosecute police officers. You can't prosecute a police officer for pulling somebody over for driving while black, for roughing up a teenager, for harassing and stalking and things like that that they do that erode the quality of life in these communities. And that's a big part of why these police departments are under consent decrees. So if self-governance doesn't work prior to the consent decrees, if consent decrees don't work, then based on your extensive experience, what are the kinds of reforms can work? Because to me, the takeaway from this discussion is that policing is unreformable and that the solution is to spend less money on policing itself, not more money, because we're not changing the legislation around police accountability. And so my takeaway is, why are we spending more money on policing for any reason?
Yeah, well, my answer is what we need is more accountability. Just as you said, DAs are unlikely to prosecute, et cetera. But consent decrees do not provide any accountability, and monitors are paid millions of dollars by local taxpayers for writing reports and telling police departments what they're doing wrong. There is no magic bullet. There is no policy, no training, no supervision that DOJ does in their consent decrees that is the magic bullet that changes anything. That it's just literally a waste of money, where DOJ could spend their resources, those resources, on prosecuting officers who commit constitutional violations, which according to the DOJ are widespread. This is not a question of, well, we don't have jurisdiction, we don't have the tools. They have all the tools they need. They just choose to allocate their resources towards consent decrees rather than prosecuting officers. If officers knew that if they violate somebody's constitutional rights, that they will be prosecuted by the DOJ, I guarantee you that their behavior will change. If there's no accountability, they have no incentive to change their behavior. Consent decrees don't do anything to change officers' behavior except make them less proactive.
Greg Carr.
Thank you, Roland, and thank you, Mrs. Scales. I think we could all agree. I think we could all agree that prosecuting police officers is a good thing, and they should be prosecuted the hell out of. We should break their backs politically with prosecutions. We both know, we all know that's not about to happen, at least for the next 4 years, and probably never. As Lauren would say, the police are a rogue element, and they're patty rollers. They've been that way since the day of enslavement. My question, you said, you asked the question, what do we do about it? That would seem to be the most effective short-term strategy. And I'm glad you brought up Chicago. We talked about that a minute ago. And indeed, the mayor did have to restore that money. And of that almost $200 million he's proposed in terms of an increase in 2025, that just about matches the 3.2% increase in just enough to cover the cost of employee raises required by the funky fraternal order of police. So as you said, you had to restore that, but it's going to their pockets, not going to any reform. And in fact, he fired the guy who was over what was it named? The Office of Constitutional Policing and Reform, Bob Boyk. The police chief fired him because he was responsible for implementing the consent decree. But he fired the guy for saying that you can't move that money from enforcing the consent decree over to putting more cops on the street, which is exactly what he did. I mean, I know you know all this. My question, and I just want to say one more thing before I ask the question about Ronald Fryer, who we both know. I'm going to set aside the deeply controversial nature of his tenure at Harvard University. He just got reinstated to the classroom in 2021, because I don't think that's related to the critiques of his research methodology. I think that the paper, I don't know if the paper you're referring to is the one he did back in the summer of 2020 for the National Bureau of Economic Research, which was questions in terms of his methodology by economists at the University of Chicago, who said that, there was probably some form of selection bias in his assertion that Black people and Latinos are no more likely to be shot by the police than white people. That's one of the more controversial things that Fryer has said over the years. And his response was, well, my data is taken from 911 calls. Well, this is a Black man who doesn't understand that Black people are wary to call the damn 911 because the police show up, they may shoot them. But we're going to set all that aside. My question is this, because you asked what are we going to do about it, and I agree with you. Prosecute the hell out of these cops, even though they're not going to be prosecuted. My question is, are you aware of any consent decree, whether it be there in Washington State or Chicago or any of the 5, I think Fryer referred to them in his area as viral incident sites, Baltimore, Chicago. He's talking about Laquan McDonald and Freddie Gray in Baltimore. And he distinguished that from the 22 so-called non-viral sites where he says you see crime going up because, as Roland said, the police just stopped going out there. Are you aware of any city, including the one you work the closest with, where consent decrees have actually been implemented by taking financial resources and putting them where the consent decree says they need to be put, as opposed to taking the money and either not spending it? Remember, 25%, only about a quarter, less than a quarter of the Chicago budget that was allocated for consent decrees was ever spent on consent decrees. Are you aware of any city, the one you study closest, where that money was actually put someplace other than money given more to the damn police to shooting us in the first place?
Yeah, I mean that's an excellent point. Is that consent decrees are not funded by the federal government, right? They're funded by local taxpayers. The monitors are not paid by DOJ. The monitors are paid by local taxpayers. All that money is taken from other services that cities provide, and that goes directly to the police department. And so essentially mayors and city councils lose control of their budgets because the monitor and DOJ and the federal judge will dictate what the city must spend on policing. And oftentimes there's lots of training. Officers get overtime for training. There's lots of policy development. There's lots of IT systems that come in. I mean, it is a gravy train for police departments. And meanwhile, other city services, particularly in areas that desperately need it, go down. And just another point about the Roland Fryer. I mean, I understand there's always. I mean, I do this sort of for a living, and people always argue with my findings and my data and so forth. The thing that I really like about Roland Fryer's papers is that it really does confirm everything that I saw that happened in Seattle. In Seattle, when the DOJ came in, we saw nonviolent misdemeanors, arrests for nonviolent misdemeanors drop by about 90%. So things like in the park after dark and loitering, and some people might say that, well, that's a great thing. We don't want police doing that. But the result is when you don't enforce these low-level quality of life crimes, then other crimes start. When people figure out there's no enforcement, and if nobody calls 911, then crime starts increasing. And I also knew firsthand all these officers who told me personally, I'm not going to do anything while the DOJ is here. Right? I'm just going to sit in my car, wait for a 911 call, and you can't. There's no way to force officers to be proactive. And so the morale. I mean, it just makes, and then it becomes this division between the community and the police. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. And
you can't. Certainly, there's a reason why Roland Fryer and what's the boy name? Glenn Lowry. There's a reason why they're darlings of the right. These are two Negroes who you can take their work and use it to basically confirmation bias. First of all, there's already a division between the police and Black people. That division was there from the beginning of the police. But my direct question was, are you aware of any city, including the one you worked in, where the policy-making recommendations of the consent decrees were actually implemented? You just said yourself that once you get that money to the local money is given to police, they do whatever the hell they want. And in Chicago, they spending it on raises because they got the damn police union that got them by the throat. Are you aware of any city, including the one you work in, where those recommendations, the dollars went to fulfill those recommendations?
Oh, absolutely, they do. They do. And the reason but just to your point, the reason that consent decrees go on for so long is because of just what you said, right? It starts out, a consent decree will start out on paper, you do these 10 things. But by the end, it's like the monitor and the judge and DOJ want 100 things. And the money, you've got union contracts, et cetera. The money goes other places and so forth. So that there's, almost 20 years were going on in some agencies under a consent decree, and they're still not quote unquote reformed yet. So what will it take? And then the other question is, after they have a new policy and a new training, if these are the policies and training that will really work and solve all your constitutional police problems, then why isn't every agency doing it? Right? There is no silver bullet here. It's just a money making.
So allow me to fight this final comment before we go, because my next guest is waiting. Let me also remind everybody who's watching. Bob said that, well, the answer is to prosecute these cops. I remember there was a woman named Marilyn Mosby who prosecuted cops in Baltimore. And what did the police department do? They rebelled against her. They said, we're not going to even work. I know when Kim Foxx prosecuted cops in Chicago, exact same thing happened. In fact, there was a judge in Chicago who reported 8 to 10 cops to the police review board, who said that he knew for a fact that these cops were lying on the witness stand. We have evidence all across the country that when cops are prosecuted by district attorneys, the cops rebel. So guess what, Bob? If the DOJ prosecutes them, the cops are going to be pissed. If the local DAs prosecute them, the cops are going to be pissed. And the reality is, we have a system where the blue line protects one another, and they despise accountability. So they don't want the DOJ. They don't want the state attorney general. They don't want internal affairs. They don't want the mayor. They literally want to be able to do what the hell they want to do. So I guess the reality is, we're just never going to have a reform system as long as the cops have they can do whatever they want with impunity, because they don't want any accountability. Final comment before I got to go.
That's why DOJ has the ability to change everything. If they shifted from consent decrees to prosecuting officers, there's nothing the cops can do against the DOJ. They can't recall them or complain about them or whatever. And DOJ has within their authority and their power the ability to dramatically reform and change policing if they chose to use it.
Question is, Bob, do you agree with getting rid of qualified immunity?
No. I mean, the thing is that the qualified immunity is not about prosecuting officers, right? That's civil liability. We're talking about prosecuting officers. I don't think the civil liability is going to change much, but the prosecuting officers, if an officer knows, if I violate this person's constitutional rights, I could go to jail. That is the best deterrent you have for bad policing.
Well, guess what, Bob? I know a lot of people that said if we impose the death penalty, that is going to be deterrent against murder. It didn't happen. I know for a fact that the reason those cops continue to do what they do, because they know that the system that we have, this is what they know. They know that district attorneys are afraid to prosecute them, because those same DAs want the police union's endorsement. Those same cops know that mayors do not want to wage war against those bad cops, because they want the police endorsements union. And they also know that when they if they do get indicted and go to trial, juries are more than likely to acquit cops of bad behavior, even when it is clear, it's undeniable, because in our society, we have scared people so much that say, don't you dare oppose cops because we need them. And so I guess we never gonna fix this problem, because it is literally, the deck is stacked in favor of cops against everybody else. But we appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Isaac Hayes III, founder and CEO of Fanbase. Fanbase is a free to download, free to use, next generation social media platform that allows anyone to have followers and subscribers on the same page. Fanbase was built through investment dollars from equity crowdfunding from the Jobs Act. People just like you helped build Fanbase, and we're looking for more people to help build Fanbase. We are currently raising $17 million in a Regulation A crowdfund on Start Engine. We've already crossed $2.1 million, but we're looking to raise more capital from people just like you that deserve the opportunity to invest in early stage startups without having to be accredited investors. So right now, I'd like you to go to startengine.com/fanbase and invest. The minimum to invest is $399. That gets you 60 shares of stock in Fanbase right now, today. And then use Fanbase to connect with friends, grow your audience, and be you without limits.